All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just go ahead and give a couple more seconds for people to go ahead and file in. All right. Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, FAFSA Simplification, What You Need to Know. Just a couple of housekeeping items while everyone gets settled. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for today's webinar, and your mics and cameras are disabled by default. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat function and select all panelists, and we will work with you directly to get it sorted out. If at any time during the webinar you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. Also note that we will be holding all questions until after the presentation. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Karen McCarthy, Director of Policy Analysis with the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators.
Thank you, Annetta, and thanks to all of you for being open and interested in this topic of FAFSA simplification. I know it's not something that has a direct impact on your day-to-day like it does for our colleagues in the financial aid office. We are going to fill you in a little bit on what's happening in the FAFSA simplification world. And I first am going to share my screen so we can see the slideshow. And I will be joined today by my colleague in NASFA's Federal Policy and Federal Relations Department. And I'm going to start off the presentation by setting the stage, as we say, or giving a little bit of background information on how we got here, what led up to this point in time. And then I will turn it over to Jill, who's going to dive into some of the details and what the FAFSA will be looking like somewhere down the road for all of your students. So the FAFSA simplification legislation appeared in what we call at NASFA as the Coronabus bill. As you are no doubt familiar, Congress has had difficulty in general for many years now in getting legislation all the way across the finish line and getting legislation passed. And so what is a very common practice now is to tack on to legislation that has to get passed, individual bills that address other types of issues. So what happened this go around is that we had appropriations bills, which have to get passed because they fund the federal government. And the appropriations bill that they were working on was called an omnibus bill, meaning it was just one giant appropriations bill to fund the federal government. Congress had to move on that particular bill, and what ended up happening is that there were some extra items that were tacked on to that piece of legislation. And what we saw tacked on to the appropriations bill for last year was first additional COVID relief funds. And if any of you have lost track of time in terms of the 3 packages of COVID relief bills, this was the second package. So this is what we called the CRRSA, which was a Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. So that was the second big package of COVID relief funds that went out to institutions. Also, as part of that really big appropriations package, also tacked on was FAFSA simplification and some other student aid provisions. And so FAFSA simplification had been in the works for quite some time, and this was an opportunity to get it to move through because it was not going to move through as an independent bill. So it got tacked onto this big bill, and it passed when when this larger bill passed back in December. So how we got here in terms of FAFSA simplification, there were some folks that were really surprised to see the FAFSA covered in that Coronabus bill, but we and many others who have an interest in the FAFSA had actually been working on the topic of FAFSA simplification for many, many years, and there had been other pieces of legislation that we would call marker bills that had been introduced. So there were other bills that had been drafted and had been introduced. And as I mentioned, things were not really moving in Congress. So those bills, while they were introduced, were kind of sitting on a shelf, just waiting for the opportunity for somebody from Congress to take it off the shelf and get it moving along the process again. And so as we saw, some of these older bills that had been introduced were pulled off the shelf, modified somewhat, and ended up as part of this much larger bill that ended up passing. So the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2019 was a bipartisan Senate bill, which NASFA did support and made some significant changes in terms of simplifying the FAFSA, eliminating some questions, allowing students to qualify for the Pell Grant using just their adjusted gross income and their household size. And you'll see when Jill talks about the details of what ended up in the final bill, you'll see a lot of these items did make it into that final bill. Around the same time that the FAFSA Simplification Act was being worked on in the Senate, we also had the College Affordability Act that was introduced over in the House by the House Democrats. And this College Affordability Act, which also was just was introduced and has not moved on its own, was a much larger reauthorization bill. So included a whole slew of issues. But one of those issues was a simplified FAFSA. And so in the end, bits and pieces of both of those previous bills ended up as part of this much larger bill that ended up passing back in December. And it incorporated elements of both of those bills. I think at the time that it passed, institutions were mostly focused on the COVID relief portion of the big bill, and were hyper-focused on that because it was most immediate in terms of aid to institutions. The FAFSA portion, while very big and a monumental change in the FAFSA, is down the line in terms of time. So there's nothing immediate that will be happening to the FAFSA. There have been some changes have been implemented that Jill will fill us in on. The deadline that was given in the bill for the changes to the federal methodology in terms of what the FAFSA calculates and spits out at the end was the 23-24 award year. So that would be the FAFSA that is available for completion starting in October of 2022. So this passed last December, and we would not see those changes on the FAFSA until October of 2022. As Jill will explain in her section, though, the changes to the methodology are really quite drastic and involve tons and tons of work from the Department of Education. They will be working directly with the IRS. And whenever the Department of Education, whenever any federal agency has to work with another federal agency, that tends to slow down the timeline just because of competing priorities and timelines and all of that. So when the Department of Education, since the legislation was passed back in December, when they took a look at everything that they were going to need to do to get this up and running, they realized that even the 2023-24 award year was a little too ambitious in terms of what they could get done and how soon they could implement it. So they have, since the legislation was passed, the Department of Ed has announced that they need a little bit longer of a runway to get this up and running. So the new FAFSA, with all the changes incorporated, will be set to roll out for the 24-25 award year. So that, again, with the timelines and how those work, that would be the FAFSA that's available in October of 2023. So we do still have several years before the FAFSA will actually look different for students and the formula will work a little bit differently. But I will say from working with the department on everything that they need to do to get this up and running, they really do need quite a long on-ramp to do this well. While we at NASFA and lots of people were disappointed that it will be delayed by a year, we definitely want the department to do this well. The absolute worst case scenario would be for them to rush it through, and then there be cases where families can't file the FAFSA and there are issues there, and it disrupts families and students and their ability to get their FAFSA through the process. So we would rather have it done well and have it come out a year late than to have a big disaster in order to meet the statutory deadline. So we at NASFA will be working closely with the department as they implement this over the next several years. And we do have a task force of NASFA members, so institutional members, so probably some of your colleagues, who are helping us to identify issues from the school level, what they need, when they need it, so that they can implement things in a smooth way on your campuses. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jill, who's going to dive into all of the detail and what the actual FAFSA changes we'll see will be.
Thanks, Karen. So part of the FAFSA simplification effort was to allow families to be able to predict whether they'd qualify for a Pell Grant and roughly how much they would receive. Currently, because the Pell Grant is tied to the EFC, the expected family contribution, you essentially have to fill out the entire FAFSA to be able to determine whether you're eligible for a Pell Grant. And if any of you have had the experience of filling out a FAFSA or have worked with students who are trying to or have done it, it's a pretty onerous task, over 100 questions and pretty complicated. So no real easy way right now to figure out if you'll get a Pell Grant. And so this idea was that there would be one concept in the FAFSA Simplification Act was to allow for simple lookup tables where a family could enter very little information and get an estimate of their Pell Grant eligibility. And they could even do that long before they were thinking about applying to college, maybe middle school or high school, just to have an idea for planning purposes. And so to achieve this, Congress based eligibility for the maximum amount of a Pell Grant and the minimum amount of the Pell Grant based on just the number of parents in the student's household and the family's income, their AGI, adjusted gross income, as a percentage of the federal poverty level, based on that applicant's family size. So this way families can enter a very minimal amount of information and find out if they qualify for a Pell Grant. There are other groups of students who will also automatically receive a maximum Pell Grant aside for people that qualify just based on their adjusted gross income and family size. And those include people who don't file tax returns. They don't earn enough money to file a tax return. So obviously, if you make that little, you are probably quite needy and meet those poverty level criteria anyway. But this is sort of a catch-all category for them. And also, Pell eligible children of post 9/11 veterans who died serving in the armed forces, as well as children of public safety officers who died in the line of duty. Those students will also receive a maximum Pell award if they have a family income and assets that would qualify them for a Pell Grant. Otherwise, they would get the maximum award as opposed to some other amount. Karen, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So for those of you who are familiar with the expected family contribution or the EFC, it's getting a new name. So this will be in 24-25 when the Department of Education implements the federal methodology formula changes. The EFC will now be called the Student Aid Index. And of course, we will be abbreviating that to SAI. This is just a name change, mostly. The SAI still determines eligibility for Title IV aid the way that the EFC does now. If for those of you who are familiar with how the Financial Aid Office determines a student's eligibility for aid, they take the cost of attendance, subtract the expected family contribution, and that's the student's eligibility for total financial aid from all sources, federal, state, institutional, private. That formula would be cost of attendance minus SAI now. So it's going to work very much like the EFC, but the inputs that go into it are going to be very different. And hopefully the name change will better explain what it is. Calling it the expected family contribution often led to conversations in the Financial Aid Office or in student service offices where a family says, wait a minute, there's no way I can afford to contribute that amount. It sounded like the government was telling you how much you could afford to pay. And so the idea behind the Student Aid Index, hopefully, is that it doesn't pass some kind of judgment about what you should be able to afford. It's more indicating that this is a way to ration limited resources. This doesn't necessarily mean a figure that you need to come up with out of your savings accounts or out of your income, but this represents sort of your place in line for the different types of student aid programs. Another big change from the EFC to the student aid index is that currently the floor for the EFC is 0. So when you go through the EFC calculation, it collects information about your family's income and then applies a number of allowances against your income, like things like basically your non-discretionary income, things like your taxes paid, basic living allowances and things like that. Takes your assets, also applies some allowances against that, uses some assessment tables, comes up with an EFC. It can be calculated as negative, but the result that you get on your student aid report is a 0. It always just, the floor is 0. The student aid index can be as low as negative $1,500. So that's a pretty significant change from the way things are now. There are no provisions in the new law that would actually allow financial aid to exceed the cost of attendance, but this opens the door because that formula that I was talking about before, COA minus EFC equals your need. If your EFC was negative $1,500, you could potentially have $1,500 more of need than what your cost of attendance was at your school. So that certainly is a possibility in the future, but right now there's nothing in the legislation that would allow financial aid offices to go ahead and award students with negative EFCs to get aid above their cost of attendance. At a minimum though, this change should help the financial aid office to be able to better differentiate between the poorest students. You know, that floor of 0 sort of grouped a huge swath of low income students all together. And often when a school is trying to help their neediest students with additional scholarships or to allocate the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, which is also known as the SEOG, it's hard to distinguish between a bunch of 0 EFCs. And so having people be allowed to go down to negative 1,500 will just sort of break out that sort of log jam at the 0 and break out the people who are the absolute neediest at the school. And I showed you on the last slide how students will qualify for the maximum and minimum Pell Awards. But for all other students who don't qualify for either that maximum or minimum Pell, based on how their family size and adjusted gross income relate to the poverty levels, those students' Pell Award would be tied to the student aid index exactly the way it's tied to the EFC now. So right now, a student's Pell amount is based on the congressionally authorized maximum Pell amount less the student's EFC. It would now just be the Congress authorized maximum Pell amount less the student aid index. So sort of, I guess, 2 ways to determine Pell eligibility. You can automatically be assigned a maximum or a minimal amount and sort of bypass the student aid formula, or you can go through the federal student aid formula and have a student aid index that is low enough that qualifies you for some Pell Grant amount that falls somewhere between the minimum and maximum. You could receive either the minimum or the maximum this way as well, or any amount in between. Karen, can you go to the next slide, please? So while a family's income is still the basis for the federal methodology formula, all income information, as Karen mentioned earlier, will come directly from the IRS. So there will be significantly fewer questions for applicants to fill out on the FAFSA. So both taxed and untaxed incomes will come directly from the IRS. So the new formula has been tweaked a little bit to account for the fact that not every untaxed income item that currently is part of the federal methodology formula is actually available from the IRS. So they've removed untaxed income items from the FAFSA that wouldn't be able to be obtained from the IRS. There's one exception, and that's for child support received, and families will still be reporting that. They'll be reporting it as an asset now instead of as income. There will also be a change in which parent is reported on the FAFSA for dependent students in cases of parental divorce or separation. So currently, if a student's parents are divorced, the FAFSA asks them which parent the student lived with the most during a certain time period, the 12 months before they filled out the FAFSA. Moving forward, starting in 24-25, when the FM formula changes, the parent whose information will be reported on the FAFSA will be the parent who provided the most financial support to the student. So that's a pretty significant change. And some students may actually, continuing students may actually see their custodial parent change on the FAFSA based on that different definition. Another significant change resulting from the FAFSA simplification is the formula's treatment of multiple family members in college. So right now, the calculated EFC is divided by the number of college students in that household, in that family. So if a family's income and assets resulted in an EFC of, say, $10,000, each child in that family, if they had 2 students in college, would have an individual EFC of $5,000, which would actually get both of them a Pell Grant. Whereas if that same family had just 1 child in college, that child's EFC would be $10,000 and they wouldn't be eligible for a Pell Grant. Moving forward, the student aid index won't be split by the number of students in college. So for that family in the example I gave before, regardless of how many students they had in college, the EFC for each student would be $10,000 and none of them would qualify for a federal Pell Grant, without a significant increase in the Pell Grant, of course. Lastly, the FM formula will still continue to retain what's called a simplified formula. Many applicants are able to enter pretty minimal demographic and income information and skip over the asset section depending on what their answers were to the previous questions. Certain applicants, based on their incomes, the Department of Education has determined that they're very unlikely to have assets, or at least unlikely to have assets that would really impact their eligibility. So they're able to skip those asset questions. And when they fill out the FAFSA online, which most students do, their demographic and income questions will lead them to either the asset questions, which they have to fill out, or if they qualify for this simplified formula, just skips right over the asset sections and moves them on to the next part of the FAFSA. Next slide, please. So as for how all of these changes will pan out in terms of who ultimately receives a Pell Grant once FAFSA simplification has been fully implemented, you can see here that most students, just over half, will receive a Pell Grant via the maximum and minimum Pell Grant formulas. So those formulas that I referred to earlier, where with very minimal information, household size, number of parents in the household, and adjusted gross income, all as compared to the poverty line, would determine Pell Grant eligibility for about half of students who get a Pell Grant. They won't go through that entire federal methodology formula that looks at income and assets and subtracts all of those allowances and everything. Another 15% of students of FAFSA applicants will receive Pell Grants, but their eligibility will be determined via that longer federal methodology formula. You'll see that some of those students will in fact still receive a maximum Pell Award. I mentioned this before, you can get a maximum Pell Award through the calculated formula or through that automatic pathway, but there are 2 ways to get a maximum Pell Award. And that's just because their calculated SAI will be either 0 or below 0. So just like now, their Pell Award would be max Pell less SAI, which would be max Pell. The rest of the Pell eligible students upon the implementation of FAFSA simplification will receive some Pell Award amount that falls between the maximum and the minimum amounts. And about 1/3 of FAFSA applicants will receive a Pell Grant at all. Their income and or assets would place them outside of the range of Pell Grant eligibility. Can I have the next slide, please? And so this one just shows you how eligibility will shift with the new formula. So you can see here that most students would not see a change or would have a very small change of less than $500 to their Pell Grant eligibility under the new formula versus the existing one. So most students, even though the formula is changing pretty drastically, most students are going to kind of hang out about where they are with their Pell Grant. You'll see that there are a number of new students who wouldn't qualify for Pell now, who actually would qualify under the new formula. And that applies in each of the dependency status and income categories that are listed here. So the net impact of FAFSA simplification and this change to the FM formula is more students getting Pell Grants. Some middle income dependent students will lose more than $500 in Pell eligibility. So much as the net impact is more recipients, there are some students who will lose, just more gain than lose. the middle income dependent students who are losing Pell, there are probably a number of factors in play. I would guess that the change to the treatment and number in college is probably a big driver of that. And Karen, can I have the next slide, please? I'm sure you guys are probably tired of talking about a formula. So I'm happy to share with you that there are other provisions in the FAFSA Simplification Act that don't actually touch the formula itself. So the first one, and this is great news, students with drug convictions and students who have failed to register with selective service will now be eligible to receive federal student aid. And this is something that's actually already been implemented by the Department of Education. So I don't know how much this audience has been very involved with that, but it's a little complicated right now because the Department of Ed was not able to update the FAFSA and the student aid report that students get that tells them that they have to register and that they can't have any drug convictions. And so there's a lot of back-end work that the financial aid offices on your campuses are doing where they're making sure that students are aware that they're eligible, despite sort of getting conflicting messages from the department. It's just a matter of timing and how systems can be adapted quickly. But it is good news that students are eligible. It's just complicated to communicate that to them for the next couple of years. There is also a thing that hopefully none of you have had to deal with called SULA, but you may have heard of it. It's a subsidized usage limit applies. And that is it was a requirement that made students become cut off from their subsidized loan eligibility once they reached enrollment in more than 150% of their published program length. So separate from the aggregate loan limits that actually cut off a student's eligibility for subsidized loans once they reach a certain dollar amount. Also, if they reached a certain point in time that was 150% beyond the published program length, they would also lose their subsidized eligibility for loans. It was just sort of duplicative because of the aggregate loan limits, and it was also really sort of clunky to administer at times, created a lot of error messages for financial aid offices. So it was nice to see that gone. There's still protections to keep students from borrowing undergraduate loans forever. So like those aggregate loan limits still apply. So it's nice to see the SULA requirement gone. And lastly, eligibility for Pell Grants has been restored for incarcerated students as well. That has not yet been implemented. That will be implemented in, I believe, 2 award years from now. Incarcerated students have been banned from, they used to be eligible for Pell Grants prior to 1994, but have been banned from receiving Pell Grants for all of that time. And now the Department of Ed is just working on all of the details of being able to restore that eligibility, but they will get that back in the next couple of years. And I think that's all I have. We would love to hear your questions. I don't see anything in the Q&A box, but please go ahead and type them in there and Karen and I would be happy to answer them.
Also, if anyone would like to speak, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can unmute you.
I know we dug pretty far into the weeds there, so feel free to ask a very broad, what is such and such, if we talked about something that just is not in your wheelhouse. We understand that this audience is not financial aid administrators, and that's who we're used to talking to. So much as I tried, I'm sure that at least I probably went a little too deep at times.
And yes, the recording will be available and you will be able to view the recording at the ACRO webinar archive. And I will go ahead and put that URL in the chat. Give me just a moment. And definitely please go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A or the chat, or raise your hand.
We have a question. Thank you to our brave first question asker. Are there any changes to graduate level borrowing or eligibility criteria? Great question. No, there are not. Everything stays the same for graduate students.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Jill, is that on the eligibility criteria side is that the selective service and drug conviction eligibility, those eligibility criteria going away would also affect any graduate students that might have been ineligible because of those two items.
That's a great point. And it can be especially, a selective service can be especially relevant to the grad student population, because not only does the student have to be registered for selective service, but they have to do it before they're 26. And so when I worked with graduate students, we would have a couple of times a year someone show up who didn't realize that they had to register, maybe had come to the US as a teenager, as a young adult, or whatever it might be, didn't realize they had the requirement. After they turn 26, they don't have an option to register. And so they're stuck in this bind where they're perfectly willing to do it, but they can't. And so this will help that population of students a lot.
All right, last chance for any last questions. A special thank you to Karen and Jill for joining us today. And we really appreciate all of the wonderful information that you've been able to provide about the upcoming changes and the simplification of the FAFSA form. That's really exciting. And yeah, no questions because it was so thorough and clear. That is fantastic. Thank you, Margot. And thanks for everybody for joining us today. And again, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Jill. And we look forward to seeing everybody again at another ACRA webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.